So now that we know about types, it's time to come back to our application code here and continue working on this application. And I would say one next step that makes a lot of sense is to make this look a bit nicer here, because to be honest, right now, this application is really boring. And for that, I'd like to change the background color from white to a nice gradient, and also change how this text here looks like, so that it looks a bit nicer, a bit more fancy. Now let's start with the background color. For this, we can go to this scaffold widget, and besides setting the body argument there to the widget that should be displayed inside of the scaffold, we can also set one of the many other arguments supported by scaffold, because most widgets allow you to pass values to different arguments. You almost always have at least one argument, like body or child, that wants another widget, which then is included in the wrapping widget, in the outer widget. But you also often have other arguments that don't want widgets, but that instead allow you to configure and or style this widget. And for example, scaffold, if you add a new line in there and press Ctrl space, supports a broad variety of arguments, for example, the background color argument. And as you might guess, the background color argument allows you to set the background color of this screen that's created by scaffold. Now, background color wants a value of type color. Now that you learn about types, you know that that thing in front of the parameter name is the type definition. And this wants a color, or actually it wants a color question mark. Well, this question mark simply means that we can either set a value of type color or nothing, so that this may be null, as it's called. We can set this to null, which is a special kind of value and type supported by Dart, which in this case is pretty much the same as not setting background color at all. But if we do want to set it to some non-null value, so to a value that has some visual effect, it must be a value of type color. Now, such a color value can be created with the built-in color class or constructor function. Now, keep in mind that I mentioned before that material apps, scaffold, center, and text are of course widgets, but that technically what we're calling here, like functions in our code, are so-called constructor functions. And I'll get back to the concept of constructor function and related to that classes a little bit later. Here we can use the color constructor function to create a color thing. Though if you're just getting started with colors in Flutter projects, it's typically easier to use the special colors thing, and then there you don't add parentheses, but instead you use a dot to access a list of predefined colors. And here you see a long list of predefined colors which you can use, like for example deep purple, like that. And if you save that and force a reload, you will see that color here as a background for this screen. And this already looks nicer than the white background we had before, at least in my opinion, but it's not the final styling I want to have here. But what is this thing here now? Well, if you hover over deep purple, you for one get a color picker, which you could use to pick a color more conveniently, which is pretty nice. You will see that if you do that though, it changes from colors dot something to color dot, and then some function that's being executed here to which some values are passed. In the end, this here is a function provided by this color thing here, which is provided by Flutter in the end, which simply allows you to create a color by mixing red, green, and blue colors and an alpha channel that controls the transparency of the color. So that's simply a way of creating a color by mixing three different colors, though of course the easiest way of using this and doing this is to use this color picker, which opens here in Visual Studio Code if you hover over it. But of course that doesn't answer the question what this here is in the end. Well, if you scroll down from that color picker, you in the end see that this from ARGB function here, which it is, gives you a value of type color. Which makes sense because background color wanted a value of type color, of course. So we got another type here, not a type built into Dart, but instead a type provided by Flutter. And what this in the end is, like all values, as you learned before, is an object. Widgets in Flutter are also just objects in the end. They are objects, and objects are the base value in Dart. All other values are also objects in the end, and objects are simply data structures in memory. So that's simply how Dart saves your values in memory on the device on which your application is running. Now, objects are a core concept in Dart because, as mentioned, all your values are objects in the end. And there are simpler objects like this text, this hello world text, but also more complex objects like this color object or your widget objects like material app or scaffold. But in the end, all these are simply data structures in memory that are managed by Dart, and these data structures can also work together. And for example, background color wants a color object so that behind the scenes the scaffold widget object is able to reach out to that color object and use that color information that's stored in that color object to make the background color of this user interface purple. So it's all objects. Widgets are also just objects, just special kinds of objects in the world of Flutter, if you want to call it like this. But all these objects are working together to bring the final user interface onto the screen. And I'm really emphasizing this because when building apps with Flutter, you will always have many objects work together. You, for example, have widgets that are nested inside of other widgets, but you also have configuration objects like this color object, which then, for example, could be used by your widgets. And that's how we could add a background color, though it's of course not the final background color I want to have here. But using this helped us get started and become aware of the important concept of objects in Dart applications.